America's economy is a slow-burning fuse, and certain states are standing directly in the blast radius. While Wall Street analysts debate whether a recession will arrive in late 2026 or early 2027, the truth is far more urgent. For millions of Americans living in economically fragile states, the collapse has already begun. These aren't just statistics on a spreadsheet. They're real communities watching their tax bases evaporate, their infrastructure crumble, and their young people flee to more stable ground. Beneath the polished economic reports and governors' optimistic press conferences lies a terrifying reality. Entire state economies are built on foundations of sand, propped up by temporary federal funds that are running dry, over-reliance on dying industries, and budget deficits that grow larger with each passing quarter. The warning signs aren't subtle anymore. They're impossible to ignore. Pension funds are bleeding red ink, bond ratings are sliding toward junk status, and the gap between revenue projections and fiscal reality widens like a canyon. When the next recession hits, these states won't have the reserves, the diversification, or the economic resilience to weather the storm. What follows are the 9 states most vulnerable to complete economic collapse as America enters recession in 2026. Number 9. Connecticut. On the surface, Connecticut projects an image of old money, hedge fund wealth, and prosperous suburban enclaves stretching from Fairfield County to the Massachusetts border. The state boasts one of the highest per capita incomes in America, prestigious universities, and a reputation as a safe haven for financial services. In reality, Connecticut is a hollowed-out economic shell held together by the thinnest of threads. The state's unfunded pension liabilities exceeded $58 billion in 2024. That's over $16,000 for every man, woman, and child in Connecticut. The exodus of major corporations over the past decade reads like an economic obituary. General Electric relocated its headquarters to Boston. Aetna merged and shifted operations, and dozens of smaller firms have fled to lower tax states. Connecticut's population declined for 6 consecutive years through 2024, with young professionals and retirees alike abandoning ship for Florida, North Carolina, and Texas. The state's budget operates on razor-thin margins, perpetually one recession away from insolvency. Property taxes, already among the nation's highest, continue climbing to fill revenue gaps, which only accelerates the outmigration of middle-class families who can no longer afford to stay. The hedge fund industry that once pumped billions into state coffers has contracted sharply, with major funds relocating to Miami's tax-friendly environment. Connecticut's infrastructure receives a D-plus grade from civil engineers, with bridges, roads, and transit systems deteriorating faster than they can be repaired. Manufacturing, once the backbone of cities like Bridgeport and New Haven, has vanished almost entirely. When recession strikes in 2026, Connecticut will face a brutal choice: slash essential services, raise taxes even higher on a shrinking base, or default on pension obligations to hundreds of thousands of retirees. Each option triggers a downward spiral. The state that once symbolized American prosperity now stands as a cautionary tale of fiscal mismanagement and demographic decline, a powder keg waiting for the economic match that recession will inevitably provide. Number 8. New Mexico. New Mexico markets itself as the land of enchantment, with stunning desert landscapes, a rich cultural heritage, and a growing film industry that's attracted productions from Breaking Bad to countless Hollywood features. Tourism brochures showcase Santa Fe's art galleries and Albuquerque's balloon festivals, painting a picture of southwestern prosperity and endless blue skies. Beneath the surface, New Mexico is America's most government-dependent state, with over 23% of its economy directly tied to federal spending, a dependence that becomes fatal when recession forces federal budget cuts. The state's poverty rate hovers near 18%, worst in the continental United States, with entire counties where median household incomes barely crack $35,000. New Mexico's education system ranks dead last nationally by most metrics, producing a workforce unprepared for modern economic demands and ensuring the cycle of poverty perpetuates across generations. The oil and gas industry, which provides nearly 40% of state revenues, faces an impossible future. Volatile prices, potential federal restrictions on drilling, and the long-term transition away from fossil fuels. When oil prices collapsed in 2020, New Mexico's budget imploded overnight, forcing layoffs and service cuts across every agency. The state's population is stagnant, with brain drain siphoning off college graduates who find no career opportunities in Albuquerque or Las Cruces. Crime rates in Albuquerque have surged to levels rivaling much larger cities, with carjackings and property crimes becoming so routine that businesses are relocating to Texas. Rural New Mexico is economically devastated, with towns that once thrived on ranching or mining now reduced to poverty traps with boarded-up main streets. The state's infrastructure budget is perpetually underfunded, leaving highways crumbling and water systems failing in drought-stricken regions. New Mexico has virtually no economic diversification. It's oil revenue, federal spending, and tourism, with nothing substantial to fall back on. When recession arrives in 2026, alongside potential federal spending cuts and another oil price shock, New Mexico will experience economic collapse in real time, with no safety net and no plan B to cushion the fall. Number 7. Alaska. Alaska presents itself as America's last frontier, a land of rugged individualism, vast natural resources, and permanent fund dividends that mail checks to every resident from oil revenues. The state's brand is built on images of pristine wilderness, abundant wildlife, and the self-sufficient pioneer spirit that supposedly defines Alaskan identity. Dig a little deeper, and Alaska reveals itself as perhaps the most economically precarious state in the Union, an isolated territory almost entirely dependent on a single commodity whose price volatility could trigger complete fiscal collapse within months. Oil revenues account for roughly 70% of Alaska's unrestricted general fund revenue, a level of dependence that would be considered insane in any other context. When oil prices crashed in 2015-2016, Alaska's budget deficit exploded to over $3 billion, forcing the state to drain reserves and slash the permanent fund dividend that residents had come to treat as birthright income. The state's population peaked in 2016 and has declined every year since, with net outmigration of working-age residents fleeing limited job opportunities and brutal cost of living. Everything costs more in Alaska: food, housing, energy, transportation, because virtually everything must be shipped or flown thousands of miles. A gallon of milk can cost $10 in rural communities, and heating bills routinely exceed $500 monthly during brutal winters. Alaska's infrastructure is crumbling under the dual assault of harsh climate and chronic underinvestment, with roads, airports, and ports deteriorating while the state lacks funds for basic maintenance. Climate change is literally melting Alaska's foundation, with permafrost thaw destabilizing buildings, runways, and pipelines across the northern regions. The state has no economic plan B. Tourism employs only seasonal workers. Fisheries face declining stocks and warming waters, and federal spending could face cuts. Alaska's permanent fund, once viewed as untouchable, has been repeatedly raided to fill budget gaps, and its long-term sustainability is increasingly questioned. When the 2026 recession combines with another oil price collapse, an inevitable pairing given global economic contraction, Alaska will face a fiscal catastrophe that could literally bankrupt the state government, leaving residents stranded in an expensive, isolated territory with no services and no prospects. Number 6. West Virginia. West Virginia trades on nostalgia for coal country, with politicians and tourism campaigns evoking images of hardworking miners, tight-knit Appalachian communities, and rugged mountain independence. The state's identity is inseparable from its coal heritage, even as that industry has contracted to a shadow of its former self. In reality, West Virginia has become America's poster child for economic death spirals, a state where every demographic and economic indicator points toward accelerated accelerating decline, with no bottom in sight. The state's population has fallen for 13 consecutive years, with West Virginia losing residents faster than any state except Illinois on a percentage basis. Young people flee immediately after high school or college, creating a demographic nightmare where the median age climbs relentlessly while the tax base evaporates. Coal employment, which sustained entire regions for generations, has plummeted from over 120,000 workers in the 1980s to barely 11,000 in 2024, and that number continues falling as automation and market forces finish off what remains. The opioid epidemic has ravaged West Virginia more severely than any other state, with overdose death rates consistently double or triple the national average, and entire towns hollowed out by addiction. Life expectancy in West Virginia actually declined between 2010 and 2024, a staggering reversal in a developed nation that speaks to the depth of the health and economic crisis. The state's infrastructure received an F grade in 2023, with bridges, water systems, and roads failing while the state lacks revenue for repairs. Unemployment remains persistently higher than national averages, and the jobs that do exist are increasingly low-wage service positions that can't support families. West Virginia's brain drain is terminal. The state produces educated young people through its universities, then watches them leave immediately for opportunities in Virginia, North Carolina, or Pennsylvania. State government finances are perpetually precarious, dependent on federal transfers and fossil fuel severance taxes that shrink annually. Healthcare access is abysmal, with hospitals closing across rural counties and leaving residents hours from emergency care. When recession strikes in 2026, West Virginia enters it already in depression, with no economic engines to restart, no young workforce to rebuild, and no hope of reversal. Just an accelerating slide toward becoming America's first failed state. Number 5. Louisiana. Louisiana sells itself as a cultural treasure, jazz birthplace, Cajun cuisine capital, and home to New Orleans' world-famous festivals and French Quarter charm. Oil refineries along Cancer Alley promise industrial might, while the port of South Louisiana moves more tonnage than almost any other American port. On the surface, it's a state rich in culture, natural resources, and strategic economic positioning. Beneath the surface, Louisiana is a social and economic catastrophe held together by oil revenues and federal disaster spending, both of which evaporate the moment recession arrives. The state ranks at or near the bottom in virtually every quality of life metric: education, healthcare access, incarceration rates, poverty levels, and economic mobility. Louisiana's infrastructure is literally sinking and crumbling simultaneously. Subsidence from oil extraction causes the coast to disappear at roughly a football field per hour, while roads, bridges, and levees deteriorate from deferred maintenance and storm damage. The state loses approximately 25 square miles of land annually to coastal erosion, an environmental catastrophe that will eventually submerge communities and critical infrastructure. Louisiana's economy is dangerously concentrated in petrochemicals and oil refining, industries facing long-term structural decline and immediate vulnerability to recession-driven demand collapse. When oil prices fall, Louisiana's budget implodes. The state has no economic diversification and no backup plan. The education system produces among the worst outcomes in America, ensuring future generations remain trapped in low-wage work. Brain drain is severe, with educated young people fleeing to Texas, Georgia, or anywhere offering better opportunities and governance. Political corruption is so endemic it's practically a cultural institution, with state and local officials regularly indicted for fraud, embezzlement, and bribery schemes that drain public coffers. Louisiana faces a demographic time bomb, young people leaving, climate refugees from coastal areas overwhelming inland cities, and an aging population requiring services the state can't afford. Hurricane season is no longer a seasonal threat, but an annual economic catastrophe, with insurance companies fleeing the state and leaving homeowners unprotected. The 2026 recession will hit Louisiana like Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. Except this time, there's no rebuilding, no federal bailout large enough to matter, and no economic foundation stable enough to support recovery. Number 4. Mississippi. Mississippi exists in the American imagination as a state of hospitality, Southern charm, blues music heritage, and slow-paced Delta living. Economic development campaigns tout low business costs and a business-friendly regulatory environment, attempting to attract industries with rock-bottom wages and minimal oversight. In reality, Mississippi has been America's poorest state for decades running, and the gap between Mississippi and the national average grows wider with each passing year, a perpetual last-place finish that reflects structural economic problems so deep they may be unfixable. The state's median household income of approximately $52,000 is nearly $20,000 below the national median, a staggering gap that leaves Mississippi families perpetually one emergency away from financial catastrophe. Poverty rates exceed 19%, highest in the nation, with child poverty approaching 30% in the Delta counties. Mississippi's education system ranks last nationally, producing students unprepared for college or skilled work, which ensures the poverty cycle continues unbroken across generations. The state's healthcare system is collapsing in real time. Rural hospitals are closing at an alarming rate, leaving entire counties without emergency care, maternity services, or basic medical access. Mississippi rejected Medicaid expansion, leaving hundreds of thousands of poor residents without health coverage while simultaneously destroying the financial viability of rural hospitals. The state's infrastructure received a D-plus grade, with crumbling roads, failing bridges, and water systems so deteriorated that residents in Jackson, the state capital, went weeks without clean running water in 2022. Economic development consists primarily of low-wage manufacturing and distribution centers that offer poverty-level wages with no benefits, creating jobs that keep people employed but still impoverished. Brain drain is terminal and accelerating. Every college graduate who can leave does leave, heading to Nashville, Atlanta, Dallas, or anywhere offering actual career opportunities. State government revenues depend heavily on federal transfers and regressive sales taxes that hit poor residents hardest. Mississippi has virtually no rainy day fund and operates on perpetual budget shortfalls papered over with accounting gimmicks and deferred maintenance. The state's population growth has stagnated, with only natural increase preventing outright decline as working-age residents flee to neighboring states. When recession arrives in 2026, Mississippi enters it already in third-world conditions in many rural areas, with no economic resilience, no financial reserves, and no pathway to anything except deeper poverty and more complete collapse. Number 3. Illinois. Illinois presents itself as the great Midwestern economic powerhouse, home to Chicago's financial district, Fortune 500 headquarters, world-class universities, and transportation infrastructure that makes it the logistics hub of America. The state's self-image is built on Carl Sandburg's City of Broad Shoulders, a place of industry, commerce, and opportunity stretching from Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Dig a little deeper, and Illinois is revealed as a fiscal house of cards, with pension obligations so catastrophic that bankruptcy may be the only mathematical solution, and political dysfunction so complete that solving anything becomes impossible. Illinois' unfunded pension liability exceeds $140 billion. That's over $11,000 for every resident, the worst pension crisis in absolute and per capita terms of any state in America. The state's constitution makes pension benefits unchangeable, meaning Illinois is legally obligated to make payments it cannot afford from revenues that don't exist. Property taxes in Illinois are among the nation's highest and continue climbing relentlessly, driving middle-class families out of state in an accelerating exodus. The state has lost population for 9 consecutive years through 2024, with net outmigration exceeding 100,000 annually as residents flee to Indiana, Florida, Texas, and Tennessee. Illinois' credit rating has been downgraded repeatedly and sits just above junk bond status, the lowest of any state, making borrowing expensive and signaling to markets that default risk is real. The state government has operated for years without a complete budget, paying bills months late and accruing interest charges while essential services deteriorate. Chicago's population decline is accelerating, with the city losing residents to suburbs and other states, while its own pension crisis rivals the state's in severity. Entire neighborhoods on Chicago's south and west sides have been economically abandoned, with poverty rates exceeding 40% and violence rates resembling war zones. Illinois' manufacturing base has been gutted over decades, with auto plants, steel mills, and factories closing while nothing comparable replaces them. Corruption is systemic and spectacular, with governors, aldermen, and state legislatures regularly indicted and imprisoned for schemes so brazen they'd be comedy if they weren't so destructive. The state has driven away businesses through tax policies and regulatory uncertainty, with Caterpillar, Boeing, and dozens of smaller firms relocating headquarters elsewhere. Illinois' fiscal problems have no political solution. Democrats and Republicans have failed equally to address pension costs, spending, or structural deficits. When the 2026 recession hits, Illinois will face a perfect storm: plummeting tax revenues, ballooning pension obligations, capital flight, population exodus, and bond market panic that could genuinely force the first state bankruptcy in modern American history. Number 2. California. California markets itself as the American dream made manifest: golden beaches, Hollywood glamour, Silicon Valley innovation, and an economy so large it ranks 5th globally if counted as an independent nation. The state's brand is aspirational success, technological progress, and progressive governance that supposedly points toward America's future. In reality, California has become a bifurcated dystopia where extreme wealth coexists with mass homelessness, where tech billionaires accumulate fortunes while the middle class flees to Nevada and Texas, and where the state's enormous economy masks structural problems so severe they threaten complete societal breakdown. California's homelessness crisis has exploded to over 180,000 people living on streets, in tents, and in vehicles, representing 30% of America's entire homeless population, despite having just 12% of the country's residents. Encampments sprawl across downtown Los Angeles, San Francisco's Tenderloin, and Sacramento's riverbanks, creating medieval conditions of open-air drug use, human waste, and untreated mental illness. The state's housing costs are so catastrophically high that median home prices exceed $800,000, while median household incomes can't remotely support those prices, creating an impossible mathematical barrier to home ownership for most residents. California has lost over 500,000 residents since 2020, with net outmigration accelerating as middle-class families, retirees, and even some businesses finally abandon the state for more affordable and manageable locations. The tech industry that drove California's economy for decades is contracting, with major companies implementing layoffs, requiring return to office that sparks further exodus, and offshoring work to lower-cost locations. Wildfire risk has made vast areas of California effectively uninsurable, with insurance companies dropping coverage and refusing to write new policies, which will eventually crash property values across entire regions. The state's budget operates through accounting gimmicks, one-time federal funds, and capital gains taxes from stock market gains that evaporate instantly when markets fall during a recession. California's income tax is the most progressive in America, which sounds equitable until you realize it makes state revenues wildly volatile and dependent on a tiny number of ultra-wealthy taxpayers who can leave whenever they choose. Infrastructure throughout California is failing. Water systems, power grids, transportation networks, all deteriorating from deferred maintenance and chronic underinvestment, while the state focuses spending on pensions and social programs. The state's public pension obligations exceed $200 billion in unfunded liabilities, a time bomb that detonates fully when recession crashes the stock market and destroys pension fund investments. California's political class remains in complete denial, proposing new programs and regulations, while the state's fundamentals collapse underneath them. When recession strikes in 2026, California will experience the most spectacular state-level economic implosion in American history, a combination of revenue collapse, population flight, business exodus, housing market crash, and social breakdown that transforms the Golden State into a cautionary tale studied by economists for generations. Number 1. New York. New York stands as the global capital of finance, media, culture, and power, a state whose identity is inseparable from New York City's skyscrapers, Wall Street trading floors, Broadway theaters, and the immigrants' gateway of the Statue of Liberty. The state projects an image of invincibility, a place so central to global capitalism that its dominance seems permanent and unchallengeable. Beneath the surface, New York is a brittle empire whose foundation is cracking in ways that will become catastrophically obvious the moment recession arrives in 2026. The state's economy is more concentrated in financial services than at any point since before the 2008 crisis, which means New York's tax revenues rise and fall with Wall Street bonuses, stock market valuations, and corporate profits, all of which collapse simultaneously during recession. New York City faces a commercial real estate apocalypse, with office buildings sitting 30 to 40% vacant as remote work permanently reshinks demand, property values plummeting, and a doom loop forming where falling property tax revenues force service cuts that accelerate business and resident departures. The city's budget depends on property taxes from commercial real estate that may never recover, creating a structural deficit measured in billions that grows every quarter. New York's subway system is deteriorating into dysfunction, with delays, crime, and infrastructure failures driving riders away and making the city less functional and attractive. The state lost over 400,000 residents between 2020 and 2024, with high earners particularly likely to flee to Florida, Texas, and North Carolina, taking their tax payments with them and leaving New York's progressive income tax structure fatally undermined. Wall Street itself is decentralizing, with traders, analysts, and executives realizing they can live anywhere and managing funds from Miami or Nashville rather than accepting New York's brutal taxes and costs. New York's pension obligations exceed $400 billion when state and local systems are combined, an unfunded liability that dwarfs any realistic ability to pay. The state's Medicaid spending is out of control, consuming enormous portions of the budget while providing mediocre outcomes and creating a fiscal drain that grows faster than revenues. Upstate New York is economically devastated. Cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse have lost populations for decades, with manufacturing jobs gone and nothing substantial replacing them. New York's response to every fiscal challenge is to raise taxes, which accelerates the departure of businesses and wealthy individuals, which reduces revenues, which leads to more tax increases in a death spiral that has already begun. The state's political culture is one of corruption, dysfunction, and denial, with governors and legislative leaders either indicted or paralyzed by infighting, while real problems fester unsolved. When recession arrives in 2026, New York will discover that empires built on financial speculation and inflated asset values collapse faster than anyone thought possible. And this time, there's no federal bailout large enough to save a state that chose to ignore every warning sign until it was far too late.